All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I think we should get started since we have some really amazing speakers lined up. My name is Trinae McDonald. I am the Policy and Advocacy Associate at Interfaith Alliance, and I'll be your moderator tonight. Like I said, I do want to jump in because we do have a really powerful group of panelists tonight with important experiences and wisdom to contribute. But before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to quickly set the stage for why we're all here tonight. So the conversation we're having tonight is critical and timely. While reproductive freedom may not be dominating the headlines at this very moment, that doesn't mean that the threats have gone away. The way the current administration is moving is somewhat unpredictable, and we've seen how quickly attention can shift and how aggressively targets can come under fire. So, as the Trump administration continues targeting our most vulnerable neighbors, and working to implement Project 2025, it's essential that we come together to defend our freedoms. And so tonight we'll be focusing on how faith communities can mobilize a powerful response and support of reproductive freedom. Tonight we'll hear from, again, inspiring faith leaders and advocates about the threats ahead, how we can defend our bodily autonomy, and how to put our spiritual values of justice, compassion, and dignity into action to protect our democracy. And before we get started with our speakers, I just want to go over a couple of logistical notes. Full bios for each panelist will be shared in the chat. Also, if you have questions for any of our speakers or at any time during this webinar, please use the Q&A box. I believe it's at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will hopefully have some time to answer those questions at the end. And then if you miss anything tonight, please don't worry. The full recording will be shared on YouTube tomorrow and in our follow-up email. So, to start our conversation, we are so thrilled to hear from someone whose leadership and vision is really driving the change in the reproductive freedom movement. Minnie Timmaraju is the president and CEO of Reproductive Freedom for All, and is the first woman of color and immigrant to lead the organization. And Minnie brings over 25 years of experience in reproductive rights, gender justice, and racial equity. Unfortunately, Minnie couldn't join us live tonight, but we asked her to speak on two topics. So the first question we asked Minnie was, what faith communities need to know about threats to reproductive freedom? And our second question, we asked if she would reflect on her Hindu values, on how her Hindu values shape her leadership in the reproductive freedom movement. So I am going to share this video. Expand this.
CEO of Reproductive Freedom. Hi, I'm Minnie Timmaraju, President and CEO of Reproductive Freedom for All. So as many of you know, the state of reproductive freedom in this country is under dire threat. We have 21 states in the United States with extreme abortion bans and restrictions that really prohibit Americans from living lives where they have the freedom to decide if, when, and how to have a family, and they have bodily autonomy and control over their bodies. And as faith leaders and people of faith, there's a particular call to action and need to be engaged. Because as we know, many opponents of our freedoms use faith as an excuse and as a cover for the attacks on the rest of us. We know that supporting families to have their families the way that are best for them is a critical component of living a life free from restrictions by the government. And so many of us, especially those of us who are immigrants, have come to the United States because of those very freedoms that we desire so much. In addition to the abortion bans we've seen across the country post the Dobbs decision a few years ago, we're now seeing increasing threats on other reproductive health care needs, such as IVF, but even contraception and birth control are under attack, which is terrifying because it's such an important way for folks to keep their lives healthy. In addition to family planning, it's just a critical medical technology that so many of us use to support our families through reproductive health care, endometriosis, fertility. We are in a moment where the extreme right has really taken over the federal government. And so we're going to see these attacks coming from lots of different directions, including attacks on the Health and Human Services Agency, attacks on the Federal Food and Drug Administration's ability to authorize abortion medication, and the list goes on and on. So I'm just grateful to be here and share some of these thoughts. I'm grateful to all of you for the work you do on this issue, and I really believe as people of faith, our voices are needed now more than ever. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my faith and my faith tradition and why I started working in reproductive freedom. As a Hindu American, my parents immigrated here from India in the early 70s and raised me in a Hindu faith tradition. We believe in a couple of critical concepts that have been really defining for how I do my work and I live my life. One of them is karma yoga, and karma yoga is the service to others. Yoga, I think a lot of folks may not realize, is actually about a spiritual practice. And karma is a word I think a lot of Americans understand. But karma yoga is service through action. And it's about getting closer to God and your spirituality through public service or service to others of any kind. And so for me, it's always manifested in giving back, and having a career in social justice has been a really important way for me to pursue my Hindu faith through karma yoga. The other really important principle in Hinduism that's important for me and why I do this work is the concept of ahimsa. Ahimsa is nonviolence and compassion. And look, I think we can all agree denials of care are a form of violence. And reproductive freedom and bodily autonomy and fighting for folks to have that full range of freedoms is recognizing compassion for the diversity of folks in this country who have all kinds of circumstances where they need these types of care. So as people of faith, I think many of us have faith traditions that show us we should have compassion for people from all walks of life, and that we should be fighting for a world where we can live our lives free of violence, including the types of violence that are imposed sometimes by our governments, including abortion bans. So that's why, as a Hindu, this work is so important to me. And I hope those principles are things we can all relate to, because so many of them are universal. And I want to thank the Interfaith Alliance for your incredibly important work and for your partnership in fighting for reproductive freedom. Now more than ever, your voices are so important, and we're so grateful for your support.
Amazing. We want to thank Minnie for grounding us so meaningfully, even from afar. We are now going to move on to our first live speaker. We're so honored to continue the conversation with someone doing deeply aligned work at the intersection of faith, justice, and community. So Reverend Angela Tyler Williams is the co-director for movement building at Sacred, and a queer Presbyterian pastor devoted to organizing faith communities around reproductive justice and LGBTQ plus equality. Thank you so much for joining us, Rev. Tyler Williams. Could you please share with us about Sacred's work and what calls you as a Christian minister to this work?
Yes, I would love to. And thank you so much, Trinae. And thank you to the entire Interfaith Alliance team for inviting me and inviting Sacred into this important webinar. It's good to be with all of you this evening and to see the names of folks who are joining us and to see so many of you from across the country who are part of this multi-faith reproductive health rights and justice movement. So what is it that Sacred does? Sacred, the Spiritual Alliance of Communities for Reproductive Dignity, is an alliance of religious leaders, congregations, movement organizations, activists, and academics collaborating to advance reproductive justice through congregational education, culture change, community building, and direct service. Our vision is that in a sacred world, religious communities shift the culture to make reproductive justice a lived reality. We create and equip a network of spiritual communities with liberative religious education and practices that shift our culture to advance reproductive justice. And just to be extra clear, we affirm bodily autonomy and moral agency. We celebrate healthy sexuality, and we advocate for reproductive dignity and the support and to support the flourishing of all people and families. And so Sacred is really building a multi-faith movement grounded in the reproductive justice framework to change the culture. And we do that in a variety of ways. You may have heard me use the term reproductive justice a couple of times now. And that is a framework, if you are not familiar with it, that was developed in 1994 by 12 Black women and inspired by the work of Indigenous women before them, that realized that we needed a broader intersectional movement, a broader intersectional agenda that wasn't just focused on the right to choose or the right to choose to have an abortion or not, and recognizing that really the second wave white feminist-led movement wasn't recognizing the full impacts and the full needs of communities of color and folks who are making those reproductive decisions. And so that reproductive justice framework has 4 tenets. It is the human right to bodily autonomy, the human right to have children, the human right not to have children, and the human right to parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. And so Sacred changes the culture through this reproductive justice framework and building our multi-faith movement across the country through a variety of ways. We have a biennial national gathering because we know that it's important that lots of folks feel lonely in this work, doing the work in their local communities or that they're in silos. And it is important for those of us who are progressive people of faith to come together and actually see each other, to build community, to build connection, to realize that we are not alone, that we are a part of this big, broad, powerful movement that actually says that the dominant culture that we're living under, that says one narrow understanding of Christianity means that we're going to have law and policy implications for all of our lives, that doesn't actually represent us. And that it's when we come together that we can shift that culture and build power to change the policies that we are all living with and to really make that reproductive justice a lived reality. Another way that we do this is through our Sacred Congregations Designation Program. This is following in the footsteps of the 5 decades of work that has existed in lots of different faith traditions and denominations to move towards LGBTQ inclusion and equality. Many denominations and organizations developed a congregational designation program, something like welcoming congregations or open and affirming, where a congregation could work through and think about their sacred text and their deeply held values and hear the stories of the people in their congregation and move to a place of affirmation and inclusion and celebration of queer folks. And so we're doing that about our reproductive journeys. So there are 1 in 4 people, 1 in 4 women that will have an abortion in their reproductive lives. And that means 1 in 4 women in every pew in this country will have that experience. But those aren't the stories that we're telling. And we want to talk about abortion, but we also want to talk about infertility and miscarriage and sexuality and bring our full selves into our faith communities. So Sacred has developed a curriculum for congregations and small groups and communities to go through. We launched an original pilot version back in 2022, and since then have trained over 450 facilitators from 240 congregations in 40 states and 30 religious traditions and denominations. And I am very excited to share that just a week from today, we will be launching our updated revised version at an in-person facilitator training that is an expanded 8-session curriculum with new resources and case studies and lots of different ways for folks to dig into this. Our third pillar is talking about media advocacy. As I mentioned before, we're living under this dominant religious narrative that assumes that if you are a person of faith, then you are automatically anti-abortion. And that is simply not true. That is not true for many of us on this call, for many of us in this country. And taking that, again, narrow understanding of Christianity and applying it to our fully pluralistic democracy and saying that that is unjust. And so we are working with faith leaders and working with our congregations to get loud and to bring their voices more into the media, to shape that story that we tell ourselves in this country, and to make sure that the stories that we hear actually represent people like us. And lastly, our fourth program is the Renewed Clergy Consultation Service. This was an initiative that was developed pre-Roe from 1967 to 1973. It started with a handful of Protestant and Jewish clergy in New York City who realized when people came to them and said, I am pregnant and I do not want to be. How can you help me, Pastor? How can you help me, Rabbi? And it grew over those 6 years to be a network of 1,400 Protestant, Jewish, and dissident Catholic clergy who were getting, at that time, as we would understand it, probably cisgender women exclusively, getting women access to abortion care that they needed. So that it was paying for them to travel, whether it was across state lines or out of the country to get the abortion care that they needed, to research abortion doctors and providers to say, is this actually a safe place that we can recommend people to go to? And all sorts of things. The landscape has really shifted. So we don't need as much, and the things that are different now, but we still need powerful faith voices. How do we use our power as institutions in our communities to leverage that and say, actually, I'm doing this because of my faith, and I'm going to act and support folks. There's some really good t-shirts out there that I will aid and abet abortion. We love those. But that is a part of all of our work, is discerning what is your lane in this movement to act for more reproductive justice in the world. And lastly, I'll talk to you a little bit about my calling as a Christian minister and as a Presbyterian pastor. I grew up, my dad is a Presbyterian pastor, so I'm a pastor's kid. The church has been a home for me my entire life. And I learned about caring for the poor and feeding people who are hungry and visiting those who are in prison. I learned all of that from my faith. And through my young adulthood and going to seminary, I could tell you the biblical and theological reasonings for like every single social justice issue until I got to my last year of seminary. And we started talking about abortion. And I was like, I know where I stand personally and politically, but I do not know what are the biblical passages. I don't know what our moral theology says about abortion because no one was talking about it to me or with me. And I said, well, how do I get on board with this? Like, how can I make that moral case? And it was in that moment, I went to a reproductive justice training and a compassionate care, pastoral care training, and I learned about this reproductive justice framework and expanding it to just beyond, are we talking about abortion and whether you can have an abortion or not, to beyond, is it the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, the human right to have a child, to not have a child, and to raise the children we have in safe and sustainable communities? And that broke it all open for me and showed me that all of these social justice issues have to come together under this one big, broad umbrella. If I knew that God was on the side of the poor, and if I knew that God was with the oppressed, how in the world could I then say, God is with you as you're making your reproductive decisions, except that one? There are no limits to God's love and God's mercy and God's care. We know that God accompanies us on our reproductive journeys throughout every decision we are making in life, and that God is with each and every one of us as we make all of our reproductive decisions, and that we are co-laborers with God in our lives, in our futures, in our families. And there is nothing that the religious right can do about that.
Thank you so much, Reverend. Your words really remind, I'll say me, but I think all of us here, about the power of faith, and the power of faith communities hold when we show up with courage and care. And we're just so grateful for all of the amazing work you're doing in your leadership, the leadership that you bring to this movement. Next up, we are really thrilled to hear from another inspiring leader in this work. Flores Shannon is the Associate Director of Movement Building at the National Council of Jewish Women, where she leads the Faithful Majority for Reproductive Freedom, an interfaith coalition working to change the narrative on faith and reproductive rights. Thank you so much, Shara, for joining us tonight. I would love if you could share with us, how are faith groups coming together to form the Faithful Majority for Reproductive Freedom? And then if you have any tips for talking about why we support reproductive freedom.
Absolutely. Once again, just to echo what Angela said, I'm just so delighted to be here tonight speaking with you all. And, when I think about the growth that we've had, I would really say that it's been fairly organic, which is such a great position to be in. From the panelists to some of the attendees that I saw who are on this webinar, I know that I spoke to so many of you when I first began in this role, ultimately to learn more and to really better understand what the current landscape is when it comes to faith and reproductive freedom. And so while we aren't seeing immediate attacks on repro in the federal space, I've certainly seen an increase in the voices of people of faith speaking out against anti-repro legislation that's happening on the state level. But ultimately, post-Dobbs, there was really this growing recognition that voices of faith needed to be heard and needed to be part of this conversation. And as someone who is a person of faith, and I previously worked for a reproductive justice organization, I knew that my faith was motivating me to be in support of reproductive freedom, but I didn't really quite know how to use my faith or my values to do that work explicitly. I'm a person in the pew, I'm not clergy, and so I felt really unsure of how I could actually link faith and reproductive freedom together. And as I was thinking about it more, I realized that there's really no secular anti-abortion movement. And that wasn't how I was previously talking about it or thinking about the anti-abortion movement. We are seeing these anti-abortion politicians weaponizing faith, and specifically this really narrow interpretation of Christianity that is being used to legislate against our bodies and our lives. And I think more importantly, I realize that those voices are very loud, but that they don't represent my religious community or those of so many of my close friends and family. And so when I was kind of digging deeper into this idea, I learned that the data is on our side, that the majority of people of faith, like our coalition name says, say that abortion should be legal in all or most cases. I think that that's really something that should make all of us on this call feel a bit more at ease. It shows us that when we kind of like zero in on who we need to be in conversation with, both to, really to kind of like work to change their hearts and minds. And also it gives us an opportunity to think about who we can really mobilize. So, if you're on this webinar, hopefully you already know that faith is such a powerful tool that we can use. It's this tool that helps us organize like-minded people who are potentially, if they are attending a house of worship, they're already getting organized. They're already gathering together. And faith is also really a tool that we can use to kind of dig deep into our traditions and values and have at times texts or just values that we hold very personally that kind of like guide our belief in reproductive freedom for all. And so organizations like ours have been working hard to bring faith into the conversation. And as I mentioned, I think we just really have such a unique opportunity at this particular moment to make our voices heard and share our messages across movements. You know, people of faith have always been at the forefront of movements to promote social change and human flourishing. And so that's why we're so excited to launch this new coalition, Faithful Majority for Reproductive Freedom, which was a partnership that originally started between National Council of Jewish Women, Catholics for Choice, and Sacred. So I really give them the credit for that vision that it was time to do something a little different. As Trinae mentioned, we are an interfaith coalition that's really grounded in the belief that a person's health and well-being should guide these important life decisions, not a politician's personal religious views, which is far too often the case. And so, as I mentioned, you know, there was really this realization that we, as a faithful movement for reproductive freedom, needed to amplify our voices and change the narrative when it came to talking about support, and also as an opportunity to bring more people into the fold. You know, I remember at the very first coalition meeting that we had, we were kind of going around the room and reflecting on our experiences. And I believe it was Trinae who said, you know, wow, like this is one of the first repro spaces where I can talk about a faith and people are not treating it as this third rail issue. It's actually welcomed in. So I really pride myself and ourselves as a coalition on building a space where people feel like they can really bring their whole selves. And so currently, you know, as I mentioned, we grew very organically and we have a little over a dozen partners in the coalition. So these are faith-based organizations like Muslims for Progressive Values, and Interfaith Alliance. And then we also have these really incredible religious institutions like the Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism, the Episcopal Church, United Church of Christ, just to name a few of our partners. And so when we started to bring people together, we had this essential question to answer, which was, is there a shared message for people of faith when we talk about repro? And so I often think about a car magnet that you can get on National Council of Jewish Women's online store that says, abortion bans are against my religion. And so when I was kind of having these preliminary conversations with folks, I was really thinking, okay, does that specific bumper sticker resonate with Christians or Hindus or Muslims? And so, you know, when it really comes to talking about this intersection of reproductive freedom and faith, we learned about a few things that I'm really excited to share with you. And so I think what is also really exciting about our work together is that we actually had the opportunity to conduct research. So we brought on a firm, Lake Research Partners, and they conducted this national survey of over 1,000 voters. And for us, that voter piece felt particularly important because we conducted this ahead of the 2024 presidential election and ahead of multiple state ballot initiatives on abortion. And we also really wanted to get a sense of how people may be motivated by their faith to go out and vote. I will also mention that we're all nonpartisan organizations, which I think sometimes people think that's a bummer, but I think it's such an opportunity and such an asset for us because ultimately I don't want to alienate someone who actually might be on our side, even if their party traditionally does not vote in support of reproductive freedom. So kind of now for some of these tips, there are four that I want to share with you. So the first is that it's okay to say the word abortion when talking to people of faith. The second is that we have a unique opportunity to lean into this religious freedom framework. The third is that we don't need to get into the weeds of a theological debate. And the fourth is that we just need to start having these conversations. So to my first point, we were really trying to test, you know, with people of faith, do we need to use euphemisms? Do we have to say reproductive health care? Or can we just outright say abortion? And we found out that yes, you can say abortion. However, if you do want to talk about the full spectrum of reproductive health care, whether that's IVF or birth control, certainly it's helpful to name those individually. But broadly speaking, yes, absolutely say the word abortion. For the second thing that I mentioned, this unique opportunity to lean into a religious freedom frame, I want you all to feel confident talking about that. This, I think, goes to the democracy piece that I know Interfaith Alliance does so much work around. Ultimately, voters believe that we do not live in a country with one set of religious beliefs, and they strongly support access to reproductive health care and abortion care. When we find common ground through values, we have this opportunity to really reinforce that the US Constitution guarantees that no one religion should be enshrined in law or dictate public policy on any issue, and that a politician's personal religious belief should not supersede your own. And so we need to identify the problem that religion is dictating public policy on these issues and emphasize that we already have a solution that voters respond well to, which is talking about the importance of the First Amendment, which includes religious freedom. To my third point about not getting into the weeds, you don't need to be a faith leader. And like you don't need to be, you don't need to be a clergy to have these conversations. And I certainly think that so many of you who are probably active in your communities, you too are a faith leader, even without going to seminary. And I think just kind of having that sense of confidence in yourself that you don't need to know the ins and outs of the religious texts. A core question at the center of this debate on birth control, abortion care, and fertility treatment is, when does life begin? And we found that voters were split fairly evenly between statements that kind of assert that we do not have a consensus about when life begins. So that means that it's ultimately up to the individuals to decide what is best for their families. One of our partners at Catholics for Choice wrote this beautiful phrase that I want to share with you guys, which is that we agree that all people are created in God's image, if that's your religious teaching. And that's why I'm fighting for rights of all people. A politician's religious views should not interfere with anyone's medical decisions about reproductive health care. We're ultimately really not trying to change people's minds, I think, as much as we're trying to blunt that wedge. And to my final point, we really just need to start having these conversations. As I mentioned, you don't need to have a deep understanding of religious text, but if you do, you should certainly go to the sacred convening that's happening next weekend. But I think in this moment, if this moment's inspiring you to get ordained, then congratulations. I'm so happy that that's that path for you. But if it's not, I also think that you are able to sort of reflect on maybe a personal moment or a specific value or text from your religious tradition that celebrates discernment, social justice, or the importance of saving a life. And just to kind of wrap up, I just want to say that by ultimately owning the faithful majority narrative on religious freedom, we have an opportunity to really reclaim a space that we've allowed the anti-abortion religious minority to seize for far too long. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you for sharing your insightful thoughts with us. There really is so much power in collective faith-rooted action. So again, thank you. And if there's any way for us to get those tips, that would be great. We'd love to share them in our follow-up email. Before we move on, I just want to give a quick reminder that if you have any questions for the panelists, please drop them in the chat or in the Q&A. Sorry, I think you just have access. Yes, in the Q&A. It's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. All right, we're going to shift focus to the legal and human rights dimensions of this fight, where the intersection of law and faith plays a critical role. So tonight we're joined by Dr. Christine Ryan, a human rights lawyer and the associate director for religion and reproductive rights at Columbia Law School's Law, Rights, and Religion Project. Dr. Christine Ryan has a deep expertise in international law, religious freedom, and gender justice. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. So if you could please share with us, what are the connections between religious freedom and reproductive freedom?
Thank you so much, Trinae, and to the speakers that I'm following. It's great to see so many leaders on this call. So to really get into your question, as we've heard, the two issues are often presented as conflicting. And similarly, in legal discourse, the rights have long also been presented as conflicting. But as a practical matter, they're interdependent. And we can think about this from a legal perspective in two ways. So the first, and Sarah actually mentioned this, the Constitution forbids the government from establishing a religion. And it's intuitive to many, and many believe, I would say rightly, that abortion bans essentially impose on everyone the narrow religious doctrine of a few. And that is the idea of fetal personhood that animates abortion restrictions. And it's rooted in a conservative interpretation of Christianity. And as such, legally, many would argue that these bans violate the principles of separation of church and state that are embedded and clear in the Establishment Clause. Even during oral argument in the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization case, that being the case that overturned Roe versus Wade in 2002, Justice Sotomayor basically directly put this question to the Solicitor General for Mississippi and said to them basically, how is this interest you have in banning abortion anything but a religious view? When you say that abortion is the only right that takes away from the state the ability to protect a life, that's a religious view, isn't it? She said. And Mississippi had no answer. And of course, since then, many states have followed Mississippi to enshrine abortion bans within their own state. And in many cases, legislators have openly invoked their anti-abortion Christian views in passing these bans. In Missouri, for example, a state that jumped to pass a ban after Dobbs in 2022, their ban explicitly says that Almighty God is the author of life. That's in the legislation. And one of the legislators during the session actually said that, God doesn't give us a choice in this area. He is the creator of life because life begins at conception. And he said that openly. And this was challenged in court by the National Women's Law Center and Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. I'll talk a little bit about what, that case failing, but, the good news in Missouri is that, the people of the state passed an abortion ballot measure just past November. But in terms of using the principle of separation of church and state and the jurisprudence around it, it's really, really challenging to do so in the abortion context. The first is basically, the current Supreme Court has eviscerated the Establishment Clause such that it's basically unrecognizable. But even before this current bench, federal courts had ruled since the 1980s that the Establishment Clause doesn't ban restrictions on or prohibit restrictions on abortion. And basically the reasoning they used to do that was to say that the Establishment Clause doesn't ban regulation whose reason or effect might coincide with the tenets of a particular religion. And essentially what they were saying is we don't have a way of saying that a belief opposing abortion or a belief in fetal personhood is inherently religious. So that was basically the standard that they had created. And it's really difficult to show that something is only religious, is only supported because of religion. But even since then, it's gotten even harder because this current Supreme Court has tightened the test even further. And you might have heard of this new history and tradition test. And that's now what the Supreme Court has set as their way of looking and analyzing issues as violations of the Establishment Clause. But, all is not lost legally in terms of religious freedom. They are very interconnected rights. And what we have seen post-Dobbs is a rise in plaintiffs challenging abortion bans as a violation of the other part of the First Amendment, that being the free exercise of religion. And plaintiffs are doing this under federal and state guarantees of free exercise of religion and conscience, and also state, what are known as Religious Freedom Restoration Acts, or RFRAs. And basically, the argument they're making is that the state is impermissibly infringing on their religious freedom of these individuals, some of them to obtain an abortion, some to access IVF, and others are arguing that it's a violation of their religious freedom to not to be able to provide abortion in certain circumstances. And accordingly, they are seeking an exemption from these laws. So they're not, this provision, using this strategy wouldn't collapse the whole law. It's just these individuals are seeking an exemption. And you would be familiar of a number of right-wing Christian organizations using similar legal arguments to gain exemptions from laws around, for example, LGBT anti-discrimination measures, the contraceptive mandate under the ACA. And so it's using the exact same law. There are a number of legal cases live this year in 2025. One in Utah, where the freedom of conscience in the state constitution is being invoked. South Carolina, where a number of providers are arguing that their religious freedom is being violated under the federal constitution. Kentucky, Wyoming, and Indiana are state-based cases where there's a mix of religious freedom, and also in the Wyoming case, the Establishment Clause is being used too. And what I'll say is, it's a mix of faiths being represented. Many of the individuals seeking exemptions are Jewish, some are spiritual but not religious. In the provider case, it's mostly Christian providers. And it's, really, this legal theory, it isn't particularly novel, and it's not necessarily new either. It just didn't necessarily need to be used when Roe was in place. And also, free exercise law has been expanded over the past number of decades by the current Supreme Court. So that's why you haven't heard these arguments in the past while. It's not that they're just all of a sudden we're trying to flip a script. But applying religious freedom law to abortions motivated by religious beliefs, or the provision of abortion that's motivated by religious beliefs, is quite straightforward. Because under, for example, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, religious believers, they're entitled to exemptions from laws that substantially burden what's called their sincere religious exercise, unless the state can demonstrate that the burden they're placing on that person is the least restrictive means of achieving a compelling government interest. And the interest, that states are asserting is that of, protecting fetal life. But the challenge that they have in making that argument is that many of the abortion bans, they have secular exceptions. For example, in the cases of rape, incest, or severe fetal abnormalities or medical emergencies. And the current Supreme Court has interpreted RFRA basically to say that when secular exemptions exist, that generally compels state to also provide religious exemptions. Now that's a bit simplified, but that's basically what they have said. And you can't say that a religiously motivated abortion undermines that interest any more than the other exceptions do, because, in all of these cases, the result is the termination of a pregnancy. And the place where we've seen that this argument be received best by courts so far is in Indiana, in a case brought by the CLU of Indiana on behalf of Hoosier Jews for Choice and a number of individuals who've challenged the state abortion ban. And that has been 2 different levels of state court have agreed with the plaintiffs in this case, and it'll go to trial sometimes this year. State courts have a very, very long timeline. So that's just, a space to watch. But, of course, I'll just say, the exemptions, they offer relief to only a limited number of people. They're not a comprehensive legal solution, but people motivated by their religious beliefs to have, assist, or to provide abortions, they deserve the same constitutional protections for their religious freedom as those afforded to conservative Christians. And that is why it's a really important legal strategy, and also one that aligns with what our prior speakers have said about the movement moving away from occupying a purely defensive posture and reclaiming our narrative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ryan, for joining us tonight and for breaking down the legal challenges. It really highlights how interconnected religious freedom and reproductive rights are. So thank you again. And we are now really excited to hear from someone who is making a tangible impact at the state level, specifically in Colorado, where faith communities and advocates are coming together to shape the future for reproductive freedom. Shara Smith is the CEO of the Interfaith Alliance of Colorado, bringing over a decade of nonprofit leadership and interfaith organizing experience to advocate for justice, democracy, and human dignity. Shara, thank you so much for being with us tonight. We would love if you could share what your experience in Colorado has taught us all, or can teach us all nationally, about effective advocacy for reproductive freedom.
Absolutely. Good evening. Thank you so much for the question, and good evening to our audience and my fellow panelists. I really love this question because this is something that we have been working on for some time here in Colorado. The Interfaith Alliance of Colorado is part of a coalition of organizations that championed the Amendment 79 bill. And Amendment 79 was a ballot measure that basically codified into our state constitution the right to have an abortion. Prior to Amendment 79, the same coalition of organizations, including Interfaith Alliance of Colorado, we championed the Reproductive Health Equity Act here in Colorado, and then moved on to the ballot measure to codify the right in our state constitution, specifically because we didn't want our rights as Coloradans to shift depending on who was in office. And so, so Amendment 79 passed. It was an incredible campaign. We were the only faith-based organization that was part of the coalition, and that put us in a very unique position of having to rally faith communities around the idea of reproductive rights and abortion in particular. And it was an interesting challenge, but I will tell you how I was having these conversations. I traveled around the state, and in the conversations I was having, I would typically begin my remarks by asking a question. And the question I would ask is, when does life begin? And then I would share with folks a little bit about our network. So we have over 400 congregations in our statewide network representing over 24 faith traditions. And when you ask that question to our network, the responses you get can vary. Some from our network might say life begins at conception. If you ask others in our network, when does life begin? They might say something to the effect of when Allah breathes the soul into the fetus. And that's not at conception, by the way. And yet still, if you ask others in our network, when does life begin? They might respond by saying at birth. The question then becomes, given this diversity in perspectives on when life begins, whose faith do we follow when we create public policy? And whenever I asked that follow-up question, that's when you started to see the faces around the room start to recognize our position as an organization, which is basically that this is a religious freedom issue, and people need to be free to make whatever decisions are appropriate for them as people of faith and as people of conscience. And so I would share with folks that, our position is the only appropriate thing to do is to stay out of these decisions. It's to not inject ourselves into these types of decisions, or to have one faith tradition create or influence public policy that then everyone has to follow. And so that became sort of the key conversation that I would have as I traveled around the state to talk to people about why we as a faith-based organization were involved in supporting Amendment 79. I also spoke with a lot of clergy. And as you can imagine, it was a very different conversation than speaking with the public, but it was also a religious freedom conversation and speaking with clergy as well. And I stood in rooms full of pastors and I would ask them a different question. I would ask them, if a member of your church is faced with this sacred decision, whose faith should guide them in making that decision? And resoundingly, they would all say, well, their own faith, right? And I would say, exactly. That is why we are supporting Amendment 79. That is why we overall support individuals making their own decisions and not being forced to follow the traditions and tenets of one particular faith when they have to make decisions about their own reproductive health care. I've had conversations with doctors who have shared with me that they've had patients show up at their offices with their pastor, and they would talk about their medical condition and what the implications were of carrying a pregnancy to term. And then they would discuss it together with their pastor. And interestingly enough, in a lot of those instances, they came back and made the decision to terminate the pregnancy because it was the most appropriate thing for the woman in that situation. And so I say all of this to say that there isn't a one size fits all scenario that suits every situation. And even though people are very devout when it comes to their faith, they still need to have the freedom and the space to assess their own situations and to make whatever decision is most appropriate for them based on their own faith and conscience. And when I spoke with people across the state, whether they were the deeply faithful or people of conscience or members of clergy, overwhelmingly the response is that people favor religious freedom. No one wants to have any single faith or a faction of a faith determining what the rules should be for the rest of us. And so based on that, we were very happy that Coloradans agreed with us and voted overwhelmingly to pass Amendment 79, codifying the right to an abortion in our state constitution.
Thank you, Shara. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your powerful work and the perspective from Colorado. It's clear that local organizing really shapes the conversation, the national conversation in really meaningful ways, and we really appreciate all the work you are doing. I also want to just thank again all of our incredible speakers tonight. I think we have a couple of minutes to take questions from the folks on this call. I think we have one ready. So a question from the chat, if everyone maybe in like 30 seconds could share one concrete action that faith communities or people, specifically people watching, can take to support reproductive freedom, and that can be locally or nationally. And I'll just open it up to anyone.
I can start. I mean, I think, similar to what I was saying before, I think just starting the conversation. And so whether that is inviting a group of friends over for dinner, or, seeing if you can borrow a room in your local house of worship, to bring some folks together. I think a lot of this takes practice. figuring out the limits of what you believe. And I think that we have such a unique opportunity to do that within our own communities. But of course, you're also welcome to go and speak with your local and federally elected officials to let them know that a person of faith supports reproductive freedom in their district.
I can follow that. The one action steps I would say that you can take is to tell your faith and reproductive story. At Sacred, we say everyone has a faith and reproductive story. Even if you have never given birth, you've never been pregnant, you haven't parented children, you were born at a particular time in a particular place to a particular people. And that is the beginning of your reproductive story. For better or worse, everyone does have a faith story in this country because as we've all named, there is Christian hegemony that is afoot in our politics and in our life. So you have a faith story, even if it is how much you have run away from the dominant forces that are present. And what we try to do at Sacred is create and hold spaces for people to weave together their faith story and their reproductive story free from shame, judgment, and stigma. And when you start from the personal, as Shara was mentioning, as Sarah was mentioning, when you start from your own experience, that is a really powerful place. And it is really hard to argue with one of my dear friends in the movement, Reverend Alex McNeil, calls about scriptural sword fighting. We don't want to get into scriptural sword fighting, but if we share for the power of our stories, we can lean there and start there.
I'll go next with just really to say, to the extent that you can, try to stay informed, because there's a deluge of horrors, every week. But like it's regularly really shocking to me that the fact that people have died because of abortion bans isn't headline news. You've all heard my accent, you've listened to me talk. Really a turning point for abortion and reproductive rights in Ireland was the horrific death of a woman named Savita Halappanavar, who was unable to get a medically necessary abortion in an Irish hospital. And for a number of reasons, there had been, deaths before, but this one, in part because of the bravery of her husband and her identity as an Indian immigrant, who didn't subscribe to, this idea that you can't talk about abortion in Ireland. The power of that story changed so many minds, drove so many people to the streets year after year. And 5 years later, Ireland went from a country with a total abortion ban, no exceptions for sexual assault, for fetal anomalies, an inaccessible exception for a life-saving abortion, to overturn that law, not just on the basis of exceptions, but to provide access. The law isn't perfect, but there's, unrestricted access up to 12 weeks, and after that up to 22 weeks, and that's flexible for some. But really, just try and stay informed as much as possible.
Yes, I would echo what the other panelists have mentioned. I think it's really important to start these conversations, to continue these conversations. I also think that it's important to recognize that despite the rhetoric, there is incredible diversity when it comes to how different faiths view abortion and reproductive rights. So yes, please have these conversations, but also recognize that just because there are some faith traditions that aren't as vocal about this issue does not mean that they are against reproductive rights or against abortion. There are some groups that are very, very loud. but they don't necessarily represent the people who may not be loud on this particular issue. And so one of the things that was very helpful for us as we approached our work here in Colorado was to listen to people from different faiths to deepen our understanding about what their thoughts were and sentiments were around reproductive rights and abortion, so that when we spoke with others, we could do so with authenticity, and to also seize the narrative from these groups that like to assume that if you are a person of faith, that you do not believe in reproductive rights. That is a farce. There are a lot of people who are deeply, deeply faithful and who also deeply, deeply believe in reproductive rights and the right to an abortion. So again, I would echo what my fellow panelists mentioned. Definitely have these conversations, but also make sure that as you're taking the time to inform yourself, as Dr. Ryan pointed out, recognize that there are some voices that might not be at the table, but not for the reasons that you might think. There are a lot of people out there who support reproductive rights, and for a variety of reasons, and from a variety of faith backgrounds.
Wonderful. Thank you. That is the perfect message to close this webinar out. I want to thank all of our panelists and everyone who is watching for joining us tonight on a Monday night. And just thank you all so much for all of the work that you're doing in your communities. I really hope that tonight's discussion is a reminder that we and you all are not alone in this. So just a quick reminder that the recording link will be in your inbox tomorrow, and please feel free to share it widely. Other than that, please take care of yourselves and have a great rest of your night.